Hey Art Nerds, today we're taking a look at a Paul Rubens Watercolor Pochet. This was sent to me thanks to Tyra. You can find a link below in the description to Tyra's beautiful artwork over on Instagram. So these little watercolor pochets, which are really just sort of watercolor paper wallets in a decorative case, these you can get them through places like AliExpress, on Wish, and on Amazon. You guys can also find links in the description below to where you can get your own. So not too long ago, we took a look at two other watercolor papers available on AliExpress, the Dore Art watercolor pad and the Academy watercolor pad. So if you're interested in learning more about affordable watercolor papers available from parts unknown or parts not the US, you guys should check out my review for both of these by clicking on the link in the cards here. So since this cute pink pochet is shrink wrapped, we're gonna go ahead and unwrap it using an X-Acto blade. This pochet contains hot press Paul Rubens watercolor paper. There's 20 pages, 30 GSM, so about 140 pounds, and it's 100% cotton. Flip it over to the back. Hot press, acid free, wet and wet technique, and reworkable. Let's go ahead and remove the delicate little belly band. You don't have to be delicate when removing it though. So this has I believe the listings say that it is leather. It feels like leather, but it could be a very good polyurethane or plastic leather. Embossed on the cover is Paul Rubens watercolor, 100% cotton, 30 GSM, hot press, so the paper type, and it's held closed with a little elastic band. This cover wraps all the way around. Now, the point of a pochet like this is to take it out with you into the field when you're doing field studies. It helps protect your expensive watercolor paper. And these sort of pochets are generally refillable. So inside, it's actually very beautiful. It says watercolor Paul Rubens applied to watercolor, color pencil, pen drawing, marker pen. And then this flips up. Ooh, hey, that watercolor paper actually feels pretty nice. So inside is hot press watercolor paper. It is block bound. The block looks quite similar to Arch's blocks with the black side binding. And it appears to be gummed on all four sides with a small opening at the top. So what we're going to do today, we're going to do a little comparative watercolor test using Core and Daniel Smith watercolors, and I have here kind of my standards. We have Arch's Cotton Rag 140 pound paper, and we have the Fluid 100 Cotton Rag paper. Both of these were created when I tested those other two papers that I just showed you guys, so I'm using these as our standard. So because this is a hot press watercolor paper, there is no real surface texture. It's very smooth, which might be why they say for pen and ink and for marker use as well. And it is going to handle watercolor a little bit differently. Not too long ago, I played around with some Legion watercolor paper. They are Legion Aqua hot press, and I really liked it. So I'm a little bit tempted to go grab my Legion hot press pad and use that for our head-to-head comparison, since these are both cold press papers and they have much more tooth to them. Now, the difference between hot and cold press is the rollers. When you are rolling hot press watercolor paper through the rollers are heated. When you're rolling cold press watercolor paper through rollers, it is not heated. So this compresses the fibers a little bit more than with cold press watercolor papers. And people who find cold press perhaps difficult to handle, perhaps the texture is a little bit much for them, or it's distracting for them, or they like doing marker work, they like doing mixed media work, or they want to ink on their papers with a dip pen nib, might enjoy using hot press watercolor paper. So after thinking about it, I decided I wanted a hot press standard of comparison as well. So I went and grabbed my Stonehenge Aqua hot press, since this is the hot press that I enjoy using the most For today's test, we're going to be using Core and Daniel Smith palettes. So I have here the Core Mini palette. I have a full review of this palette here on this channel, as well as a field test. And I'll link that so you guys can check that out. I really recommend this palette if you're looking for a beautiful, bright, saturated watercolor palette that really packs a punch. I am also going to be testing out the Daniel Smith Ultimate Mixing Palette. And the reason I'm using this palette is there is some granulation to these. So this will help show how well pigments can sediment onto this hot press watercolor paper. And once we finish swatching on both, we can compare to our arches and our Fluid 100 swatches as well. So we're building up a library of reference. I'm going to begin by swatching the Core Mini palette. Alright, next we're going to swatch the Daniel Smith Ultimate Mixing Palette on the same paper. Okay guys, I am going to do a wet into wet blended test with magenta from the Core palette and ultramarine blue from the Daniel Smith palette. I'm going to set this aside so that it can hopefully dry thoroughly and repeat the same tests on this Stonehenge watercolor paper. Now the Stonehenge is also block bound. It's block bound on the top and on the bottom. But that's not really going to pose much of a problem for us. And I'm going to be starting with the Core Mini palette first, and then moving on to the Daniel Smith palette, and then doing the gradiated blend test. Okay guys, so both of these have had a chance to dry. I find that there's a little bit more surface texture to the Paul Rubens hot press than there is to the Stonehenge Aqua hot press, but it's not an over amount of, it would be like the difference between this is like smooth Bristol and this is like vellum Bristol. So compared to cold press watercolor paper, both are still very smooth. So the next thing I want to do is I want to do a little bit of lift and movement test just to see how well the paint particles, the pigment particles adhere to the papers. I'm going to do it on both papers. So we're going to start with the Paul Rubens and then we're going to move on to the Stonehenge Aqua. We're going to do both in time lapse. So the paper is pretty securely attached and it does have black binding around it, so you may want to trim that. But once I got it started with the knife, you guys saw it was pretty easy to move. So that basically just leaves us with our mud test. And for that, I'm using 3 different brushes, a quill, a very soft silver black velvet, and a fairly soft sumi brush. We're going to do 3 layers, and just like we did for the mud test in our Dora Art and Academy watercolor paper review, we're going to use Winsor & Newton from tube. So what I've been trying to do for these tests is I'm using several different high quality watercolors that people are probably familiar with, and that's going to give you guys kind of a basis of comparison. So I'm going to do this in time lapse and then check back in and narrate my thoughts on top of the time lapse. These are my mud test notes. You can find them in the description below as well. Layer 1, I really saturated the paper with a lot of water to see if the paper would buckle. One would not normally saturate a hot press this much. They're not really designed for this sort of wet into wet into wet watercolor, but I wanted to see if I could cause buckling or rippling and whether the paper would dry flat. So I'm really trying to stress test this paper with this mud test. Eventually the water started to pool in the center, and as you will see in this shot here, eventually the paper started to come off the block as well. But that is the only area where the paper started to come off the block. So after this, I applied salt and I gave it a and using a thirsty watercolor brush, I removed the excess water. So my dry time started at 10:34 p.m. At 11:22, my first layer was fully dry, and I applied a second layer. So here we can see the dry first layer. I'm just removing the excess salt, and you can see on this first layer colors are fairly vibrant except where it pooled in the center, where they are of course muddy, and the salt had a really strong reaction on this paper. So for my second layer, I found that the colors are vibrant and there wasn't too much bleeding, but water still tends to pool, and it pools in the same area it pooled for the first test. So basically, once you stress this paper out, that area of stress is going to continue to be a weakness. And keep in mind, this is not an absorbent paper because it is a hot press paper. The fibers are more compressed than in a cold press, and it's not designed to be as absorbent. And this paper itself shows that. So once I finished applying my watercolor, I did another salt test and I allowed it to dry. And I don't have when I started allowing it to dry, but by 12:06 it still wasn't dry. And by 12:57 it was fully dry, and I noticed that it started to turn to mud, as you guys can see here. Now part of that is so much layering that we've done, so much wet into wet, and the fact that this paper really isn't designed for that. So for the third layer, I didn't add as much water as prior layers, and I found that the paper was still fairly receptive to additional saturated layers. So you guys are probably wondering, if hot press isn't designed to be used this way, why did I throw so much water and pigment at the paper? And this is a stress test. I wanted to see if I could make it buckle off the block, warp, or the paper surface start to actually degrade. And while we did have that center low point which continued to pool water, it didn't pull away from the block, as you can see here as I'm cutting it off of the block, and it didn't really cause any further problems. So you can get a really cute pink watercolor pochet from Paul Rubens over on Amazon. You can check the link in the description below. They are available in black and pink. They're available in size 3.8 by 5.2 inches and 7.6 by 5.3 inches. You can also find these on AliExpress and occasionally on Wish, and I may drop links for those as well. This was sent to me by Tyra, and it would mean a lot to me if you guys would check out Tyra's awesome art on Instagram. You can find a link to that in the description below. I was pretty impressed by the quality of the watercolor paper in this very affordable little pochet. The 7x6 by 5.3 size one, that's the one I have here, goes for $12.96 on Amazon, which isn't a bad price at all. The smaller size seems to be more of a really cute watercolor sketchbook, so I'd be interested in trying that, particularly if it is also cotton rag paper like this. So this comes with 20 sheets of hot press cotton rag watercolor paper, and it's 140-pound paper, so it's one of the thinner papers, but this is the thickness I usually paint on anyway. It takes color quite brilliantly. You can do several really wet layers on it, and while it does get somewhat muddy, it doesn't turn to complete mud, and it getting muddy would be expected because this is hot press watercolor paper, and that's not designed for saturation. Cold press is really more designed for saturation. So I hope you guys will stick around and keep an eye out for the upcoming field test for the Paul Rubens watercolor. They're calling it Paul Rubens Watercolor Paper Block Premium Leather Cover Artist Quality Hot Press Paper for Watercolors and Wet Media Block, 140-pound, 20 sheets, pink cover. So I hope you will stick around for the field test of that. So from top left to bottom right, we have the Fluid 100 cotton rag paper, the Arches cotton rag paper, we have the Stonehenge Aqua hot press cotton rag paper, and the Paul Rubens hot press cotton rag paper. The colors on the Paul Rubens watercolor paper down here at the bottom right, They're fairly bright and vivid, a little bit more bright and vivid, I would say, than on the Stonehenge Aqua hot press. So these are our two hot press examples. They're not quite, but almost as vivid as on the Arches and on the Fluid 100. There isn't as much granulation because it is a hot press. There aren't the divots in the paper for the paint to actually sink into, and most of this curving occurred after I removed it from the block and it absorbed atmospheric water. So I wouldn't say that's a flaw with the paper itself, but rather a flaw of the environment, because you can see these papers are also a little bit curved as well. The black binding on the block, you may find that distracting, or you may find that it takes away from the piece itself. You could remove that using a paper trimmer and just trim that off, or you could just buy a different paper. Arches also, the Arches block bound pads also have this black binding, and the Blick Premier also has this black binding. So it's not uncommon within the watercolor paper world to have those sort of black bindings, but it is something you're going to want to kind of think about, because you can see it on the block itself. I found that the colors were not necessarily more prone to lifting than on the cold presses and on the Stonehenge Aqua. So I feel that it is pretty dang decent as a hot press cotton rag paper. I really do look forward to playing with it more and seeing what it's really capable of. I hope you guys found this video helpful, useful, and informative. If you did, make sure you leave a like. If there are other cool watercolor products that you'd like me to check out, comment below in the description and I'll go and scope them out. Maybe do a little bit of reconnaissance, and you might even see it in an upcoming video. I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and if you like what I do and you want more of it, make sure you click subscribe and hit the bell notification so it lets you know when I update. And I update at least 2 days a week, usually more, with watercolor content, comic content, and alcohol marker like Copic content. If you want to check out my work, you can head on over to 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com and read my beautiful watercolor webcomic 7inch Kara. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys again really soon. And I want to thank my wonderful sponsors in this video, Tyra, for sending me this beautiful little watercolor pad, and my art nerds over on Patreon. I would not be able to do what I do without you guys. Thank you guys so much. All right, guys, have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.